In the order they were played, here are 8 JRPGs I experienced from January to April, starting with Monochrome Mobius, Rights and Wrongs Forgotten. Now, even though the name may sound odd, Monochrome Mobius is actually a part of the far more recognisable Utaware no Mono series, acting as a prequel to Mask of Deception. Made to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the series, Aquaplus also looked to reinvigorate the gameplay from the bottom up. Instead of taking on their standard visual novel approach, Monochrome Mobius was crafted in the style of a traditional JRPG, sporting a linear story, character progression, turn-based combat, and side quests. But with inexperience comes a host of oversights, and it would be a stretch to say that Monochrome Mobius is a masterpiece. The character models look like a callback to the PS3 days, the transitions are jumpy, and the animations are stiff. The combat is also not the deepest you're going to find. It's got the standard fare in character-specific skills, buffs, debuffs, and the like, but it's not going to impress any veteran of the genre. However, what Monochrome Mobius does excel in is, unsurprisingly, its music, characters, and story. It's very clear that Aquaplus wanted to maintain a grounding in their visual novel roots with this game, giving us recognisable environments and diving into plot points that weren't explored too heavily in the original 3 titles. The main cast of characters are not only familiar to those who played the Mask games, but are also fantastic as a standalone, each with relatable arcs and strong character development. And it's pretty clear based on the events in this game that Aquaplus don't want Monochrome Mobius to be just a prequel. They're aiming for something even more grand, and knowing that, I hope that the next chapter will be upon us in the near future. Up next is the most recent Neptunia entry as of the time of recording, and it's for Neptunia Sisters vs Sisters. This was my first game in the series, and unfortunately, it might be my last. I gave this game as much time as I could, 12 hours, which is over what I normally allow for games that don't click with me, but I was hoping to find something to latch onto, and so I pushed on, but eventually I just had to accept that the game was not for me. Sisters vs Sisters is advertised as a game that newcomers can enjoy, which is why I made the choice to give it a go. If I got hooked on this one, then I had a whole multimedia franchise to get stuck into. And don't get me wrong, I can see why people enjoy it. Unlike games like Agarest or Star Ocean Integrity and Faithlessness, which were completely irredeemable in my eyes, there were a few moments that I had a good time with, mostly related to the diverse cast of characters and its wacky premise. But characters can only take a game so far, and this one had a couple of glaring issues that led to me abandoning it soon after. First of all, this game is not for newcomers. Even as a spin-off, it has a bunch of references to what I assume are earlier games, and the standalone story didn't do enough to get me invested. I feel that if I had a prior connection to these characters, I might have latched onto it more, but alas, I didn't. Secondly, disc creation is a big part of progression in this game, and it costs a fair amount of resources. The issue is that it's heavily randomised, which can double your time doing menial tasks till you get what you need. Not a fan of that. And last of all, the combat. Oh my word, this is some of the most shallow action-based combat I've ever experienced. Not to mention, it commits the cardinal sin of action RPGs in that it feels sluggish and unresponsive at many points. For example, the RNG disc creation we mentioned earlier is the only way to cancel combos, at least from the 12 hours I played, which is what I consider to be a core part of this genre of gameplay. Without it, animations take way too long, frame data feels inconsistent, and the actual dungeons themselves are unmistakably bland. Hallways where you find a switch, open a door, and then rinse and repeat till you get to the end. Normally, gameplay isn't the element that stops me playing, but I at least need other points of the game to hold it up, to keep me engaged. But Sisters vs Sisters didn't have that. Next up is Octopath Traveler 2, and I'm happy to say that unlike our previous entry, I had an absolute blast with this game. I knew after my first 3 hours with that demo that this sequel would be right up my alley, and my word did it deliver. I adored it from start to finish, from the characters to the stories, the music, the art style, everything was near on perfect. I could not put this game down from the moment I picked it up all the way to the end of my journey. And what's really struck me almost immediately with Octopath 2 is how much freedom it gives you. In a genre where you're often confined to a linear route and only later does it open up, Octopath 2 just releases you into the wild to make your own story. This here is a game that encapsulates the feeling of adventure, the thrill of the unknown. Not since Ys 8 have I experienced something like this. I was so enamored with the world and the multitude of ways I could interact with it that it worked to my detriment in that I quickly over-leveled myself. By the time I got to the second chapter of the individual stories, many of my team were well well into the 50s, which made story progression a doddle. But I'm all on board with the fact that it gives players that choice. That is never a bad thing. It's a sign of a great game when it's happy to give more control to the player to progress in the way they want. And like I say, this world was so rich and full of secrets that I couldn't help myself. I had to explore everything. Adding on to its exploration was its fantastic combat, fast, visceral, oozing in customization, and even though one of the only drawbacks of the game involved revisiting inns to reshuffle the party at points, it wasn't a problem for me as I was just so hooked on the combat, not to mention each character felt wholly unique in what they brought to the table. And last of all, its story, the one thing that many players felt was a weakness of the first, and I confess the part I was worried about. How could they take 8 stories and combine them? How could they make this world weave around 8 different narratives? Well, they did it. They actually did it. Octopath Traveler 2 has wondrous storytelling, if you pay attention to it. It's got a story that reminds me a lot of the Souls games in some ways, and that even though it gives you plenty of surface level information to have a good time, if you really dig beneath the lore and connect the dots, you'll start to find even more nuggets of information that brings this world to life even more than it initially shows. It really is a fantastic game, no doubt one of the best I'll play this year, and I cannot recommend it enough to anyone who enjoys JRPGs. Up next was Shin Megami Tensei 5, a game that I intended to play last year, but you know, things don't always end up the way we plan it. But I am glad I got to try it this year because once again I had a really good time with it. It's more of that brutal S&T gameplay that requires a good deal of input from the player at all points, not to mention a solid understanding of its mechanics as well. What I do like about SMT 5 is its semi-open world format. The zones themselves are large enough that exploration becomes a big part of the experience, and sure, they're drab and barren aesthetically, but they're meant to be, so I don't see a problem design-wise. All in all, there's a good deal of verticality, plenty to find off the beaten path, and a good amount of side content on offer as well that feeds in directly to the Nahobino's progression. However, the more I played it, the more I ended up comparing it to SMT3 Nocturne, and honestly, I did prefer that game over this latest iteration. While SMT5 has all of the quality of life improvements and indeed has strong gameplay, I found that I just preferred 3, and that mainly came down to its ambience and setting. I felt Nocturne handled its atmosphere better in that you never felt safe in the game and you're always on edge. I do prefer the story in SMT3 as well, though narrative is never really the focus of these games, but that's not to discredit SMT5, which was still a great game in many respects. The 5th game I played through was the first in my retro series, and it was for Art & Eleko Melody of Alemia. I already did a fully dedicated video to this, so I'll keep the commentary here brief. Created as a collaboration between Gust and Banpresto, Art & Eleko is centered around the adventure of Lina Barset as he attempts to stop the spread of viruses from taking over his home. To do that, he has to find a hymn crystal in the world below and is assisted by a host of characters. Now, while the story wasn't the most original, Art & Eleko got major points from me in terms of its OST and combat, both of which were stellar. Combat in particular took the turn-based approach but added its own twist with the use of the Ravertails, who use their own unique skills to support from the back, and more of these are unlocked through so-called Cosmospheres, which are basically the game's method of exploring the stories of each Ravertail in a visual novel format, which was easily my favourite part of the game. It certainly had flaws, but Melody of Alemia shone in many of the areas I place importance on, and I'll happily play the sequel when the time comes. And here is the second in the retro series in Radiant Historia Perfect Chronology, which I also did a full video on, so once again commentary here will be brief. In short, it's a really good game. It's all about progressing through 2 timelines in order to find the true history, but obstacles in one can only be surpassed by interfering with the other. Radiant Historia is arguably the best RPG on the DS, and indeed the best RPG on the 3DS when it was remade. It's got an excellent story, a decent cast of characters, and a solid turn-based combat system which offers a wide array of customization and options to the player. As the game drew on, it started to get more tedious, I'll admit, such is the nature of the combat in this game, but that was only after hitting the 30-hour mark or so, and it didn't take me much longer to finish after that. If you want my full thoughts, check out my video from a couple of weeks back. Up next is the final DLC volume for Xenoblade Chronicles 3 in Future Redeemed. It's very rare that I go back to a game after finishing it just for DLC content, but Monolith Soft consistently makes that revisit worthwhile, with their added content pretty much becoming fully fledged games in of themselves, such as Torna and Future Connected. The same holds true for Future Redeemed, bringing in its own additions to the lore and getting a bit of fan service in there as well with the return of some recognised characters. But Future Redeemed does not need to lean on fan service in order to shine. In fact, it more than holds its own and gives players a good 20 to 30 hours of playtime filled with value. The combat is slightly changed from the Xenoblade Chronicles 3 base, yet still is mostly grounded in the original. There's a new land to explore, plenty to find, and indeed a story that ties up some loose ends. For me, this final chapter felt like a reward in many ways for going through the entire series, a final hurrah before Monolith Soft move away from this particular story. It is one of the grandest narratives told in JRPGs without a doubt, and I was very satisfied with its conclusion. Last on the list for this first recap video of the year is Fairy Fencer F Refrain Chord, the direct sequel to Advent Dark Force and a return for the likes of Fang and Eren. Now, unlike the first game, which was more a turn-based affair, Refrain Chord shook up the formula completely, switching to a tactical approach more akin to a Final Fantasy Tactics or Fire Emblem. However, what sets it apart is the use of muses, which are basically support units that buff others within a radius. What's really cool is that the muses themselves, Fleur and Glass, evoke these powers through song, and it leads to some pretty sick beats as a result. Now, I would have preferred to hear more than one song, maybe a different tune for each buff to add some variety, and maybe that was the case later in the game, but alas, I never experienced this. And the reason for that is because, just like Sisters vs Sisters, I ended up abandoning it about 8 hours in. The first Fairy Fencer was okay in my book. It wasn't what I would consider to be excellent, but I can certainly see the appeal when it had some good moments in there. The same holds true for Refrain Chord. I can see a lot of people enjoying it for its light-hearted approach, the colourful cast of characters, and the slice of life moments. But again, for me, it just doesn't have that pull that draws me in for the long haul. There's something about the gameplay loops in these titles that just doesn't resonate with me, and I'm not sure what it is. Heck, I've played similar games in terms of their cozy approach like Atelier and never got bored with those, but Refrain Chord just didn't grasp me with that same sense of enjoyment. Also, I have to call out the gameplay once again. While the strategic skeleton is there in terms of skills, units, and carried over mechanics like Fair Rising, it's just too slow. Enemies have way too much HP while you do far too little damage, so battles go on for longer than they should, and the same applies to enemies going after you. There's not really any danger there, it feels more like a wet noodle fight. Add on to that the use of the muses, Fleur being the allied one and Glass the enemy. This mechanic effectively puts the game in a trap of its own, as much of its gameplay is centered around the muses, and what this means is that you'll pretty much see Glass in every fight, from story events to battles against mundane groups of enemies. It takes away from the special feeling that these moments should have, in my opinion, and I think it would have been better served if Glass only appeared in the important events to give the player something to look forward to. And it sucks because the game has lots to like. There's elements there that are good, like its extensive customization, its optional events, and its decent group of characters. And for that reason, like I say, there will be people who enjoy it. But for whatever reason, it just didn't do anything for me, and I doubt I'll be going back. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe for more JRPG content, and consider joining my Patreon if you're interested. Peace.